I want to begin by going through Mark chapter 7, verses 31 to 37. This is the only miracle which Jesus worked, at least in the first half, in which Jesus uses external methods. There is another one also in chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. And so this miracle is the miracle that we will focus on. Even as we move on, we see that Jesus has returned from Tyre and goes by way of Sidon. Mark's geography is very, very vague, because Mark's geography is not the best, as we have seen already in the past. And so, therefore, when we look at this particular text, we notice they bring to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech. Notice the man is not dumb, but it is likely that because he was deaf, he would have been unable to speak properly. What does Jesus do? Jesus takes this man aside, away from the crowd. Away from the crowd could be for a variety of reasons. And even though aloneness, that means Jesus wanted to be alone with the man, that is one of the suggestions. Jesus wanted to ensure that others did not realize who exactly he was. But here, it seems very strange that the messianic secret could be one of the reasons, because the people brought the man to Jesus, and Jesus does not, at least now, when he takes the man aside, give any command to silence. That comes later. To avoid curiosity seekers could be on the surface level, but it seems from the background, that is of the Gentile territory, and the fact that the Gentile faith healers would use these methods, which were secret methods. It seems that Jesus takes him aside in order to maintain the secret of the healing, like the Gentile faith healers would also do. And so, therefore, this is basically what is the situation in this moment. So what does Jesus do? He puts his fingers in the man's ears. He spat and touched his tongue. In other words, Jesus uses external methods and he heals the man. And the reason why Jesus uses external methods is because Jesus is in Gentile territory. So therefore, he does something which the people around him would understand. And that brings us to this point of inculturation, which we have been talking about for so very many years now, that we use a language, we use symbols, we use that which can be understood by people. So very often, even those people who are knowledgeable are unable sometimes to understand the symbols that we use and the language that we use. If faith has to be made relevant, if faith has to be made practical, if people are really to be able to be transformed, then we have to ensure that the symbols that we use are relevant to those whom we are communicating with. And that is why there can be no universal symbol, because very few universal symbols, like maybe a smile, maybe a friendly gesture, only those could be universal. But otherwise, not very many things are universal. And that is why we need to situate ourselves where we want to communicate our faith, like Jesus does. So if Jesus is in a territory where they will understand external methods, where they will understand external incantations and looking up to heaven and imploring God, etc., then that is what he would do. So here, when Jesus looks up to heaven, it was and is must be interpreted as prayer of Jesus. But more in keeping with the situation rather than the need of Jesus to look up to heaven to pray. Even the cry, and we have seen in the past that there is no need for cries when Jesus is healing. The use of ephata in Aramaic also seems to indicate that it was, in a way, a secret formula. The words, in a sense, are enough, and the man's ears are open, and he was able to speak properly. So both the impediments, that is his deafness, and the impediment in his speech, are also taken care of. Here, because the people bring the deaf man with an impediment in his speech to Jesus, that's why Jesus orders them to tell no one. The command, however, is disregarded. The point is that Mark wants to tell us not so much the result of what the command to silence would have, but he wants to tell us about the command to silence. So the focus of Mark is more the command. Jesus tells them to tell no one simply because he does not want to be known as someone who could merely heal the deaf and people with impediments in their speech. This is the intention of Jesus. This is the intention of the Mark in Jesus. And Mark, however, will indicate how difficult it is on the ordinary and logical level, how difficult it is to maintain that command. And so, a person who is healed, like the leper in chapter 1, verse 44, he would go and want to tell everyone. Like the demoniac in chapter 5, verse 20, is told, go and tell everyone in the Decapolis, that is in the 10 cities. Here, Mark also tells us in conclusion that the more he ordered them, the more zealously. Mark is not only meaning this particular group, but also in general. The more Jesus would say, don't tell anyone, the more people would talk about it. In other words, to indicate how difficult it was to maintain that secrecy that Jesus wanted to maintain, mainly that he was not only this kind of Messiah. The people were astounded, and that is in a way natural. He has done everything well, namely hearing, making the dumb speak and the deaf hear, in a way of what the Messiah was expected to do, or what God was expected to do. The second feeding miracle is a miracle in which the disciples do not show any knowledge of the first miracle. Now, while some think that it is because of the fact that Jesus basically would have said, or rather that the disciples would in a way not have remembered, and that Mark has put this as a second feeding miracle when actually there was only one feeding miracle. This is a duplication. That is why the disciples have not understood. Given Markan misunderstanding, it is not impossible to believe that the disciples in Mark would not have remembered. And Mark gives us a number of indicators to show that this is, in a way, a separate feeding miracle, not a duplication merely of the first one. In those days, notice, by using this term, again, Mark is telling us that he remembers that there was a great crowd earlier. So the use of again, namely again a great crowd without anything to eat. So in other words, if there's again, there would have been a crowd earlier without anything to eat. And this is basically what Mark is indicating, that now there is a crowd. In their first feeding miracle, we might remember that the compassion which Jesus had for the crowd resulted in his teaching them. It is likely that the focus on nothing to eat is because of the 3 days which they have been with Jesus. And so it is also likely that they would have had their provisions for the 3 days. Jesus would have taught them during those 3 days, and now for after 3 days, they had exhausted their own provisions which they had brought. So therefore, the 3 days is an indication that they have really followed Jesus and hung on his lips and been with him a long time. And so therefore, in this miracle, there was again a great crowd, as we have seen, without anything to eat. Here, Jesus takes the initiative. So he calls his disciples and takes the initiative, tells them about his compassion. And the compassion here, unlike earlier, which later resulted in fulfilling the physical need, the compassion here manifests itself in the desire of Jesus to fulfill already the physical need. And the reason seems to be because of the 3 days, and the teaching may have been given to them in those 3 days. Now, some of them have come a great distance. This is one of the indications which Mark gives us to show that it is a Gentile feeding. Even though only Matthew among the other Gospels has this feeding miracle of the 4,000, in Matthew's Gospel, very clearly, it is not a Gentile feeding, it is a second feeding miracle. As a matter of fact, there are many changes which Matthew will make in his narration in chapter 15 to show that it is not a Gentile feeding, but a second Jewish feeding, even if it is less abundant. The reason is because in Matthew's gospel, during the lifetime of Jesus, there is no scope for a Gentile mission. That will come only after the risen Jesus gives the command to the disciples on the mountain. Here, the fact that it is a Gentile feeding is indicated here through this phrase. Some of them have come a long distance. So the phrase indicates that it is basically a Gentile feeding. The disciples here are not sarcastic. However, they already put a dampener. They already put an obstacle. They already put a hurdle to what Jesus can do. Even though earlier we saw that the townspeople had put that obstacle when they took offense at Jesus, that was a different kind of obstacle. That came, so to speak, from outsiders. And there was unbelief. Here, it is not as if the disciples believe, and yet there is a certain kind of openness, if not faith, as is indicated by their obeying the commands of Jesus. So they are skeptical. They put a limit in a way to what Jesus can do, and yet Jesus has to invite them to go beyond their skepticism when he tells them, how many loaves do you have? And they said 7. Now their answer here shows that they are slightly open, because the answer could have been, they said only 7. But they say 7. In other words, now slowly they seem to be learning, and they are offering now to Jesus what exactly they have. They said 7. Here, the word sitting down is to recline. So basically, when the text tells us, then he ordered the crowd to sit down. Here, notice there is no green grass. They sit down on the ground. But here too, like in the earlier feeding miracle, it is not merely a sitting down cross-legged, or it's not merely a sitting down with your legs stretched in front of you. No, it is a reclining. Even though a different word is used, reclining basically symbolizes a festive occasion. Reclining symbolizes that this occasion is a special occasion, and that Jesus is going to do something special. Here, unlike in the earlier feeding miracle where Jesus gave thanks and the Greek verb for he said the blessing rather in the earlier feeding miracle, eulogein, he said the blessing. Here he gives thanks, and the Greek verb is eucharistein, to give thanks. So in a way, it might be too far-fetched to say that Jesus celebrates the Eucharist with his disciples and with the crowd here, because he does that at the Last Supper. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 6, in which the feeding of the 5,000 is found, most think that there to give a Eucharistic interpretation would be more valid, because there in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives thanks already in the first feeding miracle, where all the synoptics have said the blessing. And there in the Gospel of John, Jesus gives the bread to the people himself, not through the disciples. Here and in the earlier feeding miracle, Jesus gives the disciples the bread, and they are the ones who give it to the people. There could be something of the anticipation of the Eucharist here, but there is surely the association of the bread with Jesus himself. So Jesus giving of himself. Because the bread is so important, the fish really are not as important and are mentioned almost as an afterthought, and so the fish also are distributed. The word which Mark used early on for baskets was kophinos. Here, he uses the word for basket, which is a Gentile term, spuridas. So there were 7 spuridas full. The numbers are less than the earlier one of the amount collected. The number of people fed are less, but the requirements are more. So 7 loaves and few fish are required to feed 4,000, and comparatively only 7 baskets are gathered. Even to this interpretation, the same interpretations have been given about how the miracle would have occurred. However, Mark does not give us the details of the miraculous nature of the miracle, only tells us that Jesus did have this ability. When Jesus gets into the boat, we remember chapter 6, verse 45. In chapter 6, verse 45, after the first feeding miracle, Jesus sent his disciples away. And the disciples were sent away because Jesus wanted peace and quiet, and Jesus wanted to pray. After the first feeding miracle, Jesus goes to the mountain to pray for the second time in the Gospel of Mark. The first time was in chapter 1, verse 35, when he was becoming more and more popular, and the people were accepting him more and more. And the second time also was a similar situation in which he had just fed 5,000 people. And so even though Mark does not give us the details of the reaction like John does, where they wanted to make him king, it seems also that the people after the first feeding would have been excited and wanting to extol Jesus, which Jesus does not require, and so goes to the mountain to pray. In the second feeding miracle here, immediately after the feeding miracle, Jesus gets into the boat, and here he accompanies the disciples, and possibly to get away from the crowd. The Pharisees, who are mentioned earlier also in the text, are the ones who come to him now and with a demand. And what is the demand that they make? They began to argue with him. In the Gospel of John, the word semeion is a word which John the evangelist uses to point to the miracles of Jesus. When he says after the miracle at Cana, this was the first of the signs that Jesus worked at Cana in Galilee. So signs, semea, sign, semeion, is a word in John which points to something beyond itself. When John uses the word sign, he's telling his readers, do not get caught up with the miracle, because a sign is something which points to something beyond itself. You cannot stop at the sign. You must go beyond the sign. And so here in the Synoptic Gospels, sign is a bad word because of the context in which it is used. And here we are told the Pharisees began to argue, asking for a sign. And why are they asking for a sign? To test him. The word sign does not refer to a miracle, but they are asking for some credibility. They are asking for his credentials. They are asking for where he is getting all of this authority from to test him. They want to put him to the test. So, in other words, they see that Jesus is doing a number of things, and yet they are unable to accept. And so they want proof. Now, the reason why Jesus sighs deeply in his spirit is because he realizes that for those who believe, no sign is necessary. For those who do not believe, no sign is sufficient. And that's why here Jesus realizes their unbelief, and so asks once again not so much a question which has to be answered, but a rhetorical question, namely, why does this generation ask for a sign? And then he goes on to say, almost answering his own question, because it's not a question, it's rhetorical, which means to say, do not ask for a sign, because no sign will be given. And why will no sign be given? Because all the signs which are required have already been given. And if your eyes were closed when the signs were being given, if your ears were closed when the signs were being given, then you will not see, neither will you hear the sign. Second, if your requirement of a sign is only to test, then you will never see whatever sign is given. You might remember that in an earlier lecture, I spoke about Matthew chapter 9, verses 32 to 34, in which Jesus heals a deaf and dumb man. And the reaction to that miracle was a dual reaction. While one group says, we have never seen anything like this, another group says, he casts out demons by the prince of demons. And that's why no sign is given to those who demand a sign, because they will see what they want to see. And by going to the other side, basically what Jesus is saying is that he is moving away from them. The other side is not only the physical side, but it is also the theological side. We cannot stand on the same side as far as our ideas are concerned. This is a time when we are all going through tremendous challenges. And the challenge is basically, how do we handle this situation? What do we say about it? What do we do about it? And so we need a sign. We need God to rend open the heavens and come down. So what is our response? Do we keep looking for a sign and ask God to give us the sign so that we can confirm our faith? And the Lord refuses to give a sign. because faith, if it is genuine, requires no sign. In the last part and the last chapter of the Galilee section, we come across the conflict. You might remember that the 3 chapters in which we studied the Galilee section each had summary, something connected with the disciples, the broad part of the kingdom, and the conflict. Earlier in chapter 3, verse 6, the conflict was created totally by outsiders, the Pharisees and the Herodians. In chapter 6, 1 to 6a, the conflict was created closer home by the townspeople. Here in chapter 8, 14 to 21, the conflict is created closest and by the disciples. Mark tells us that the disciples had forgotten to buy bread. The reason why Mark uses bread, it seems to me here as a metaphor for misunderstanding, is because of the 2 feeding miracles which we saw earlier. Or else, Mark would have said the disciples had forgotten to bring any food, but he deliberately uses artos, which is bread, to remind us of what had happened earlier. So it is not so much food, but bread which is the focus. And Mark uses bread here as a metaphor for the misunderstanding of the disciples. But what did they have with them? They had with them 1 loaf. Some interpret the 1 loaf to be Jesus, which they did not know, but it does not seem to me. It does not seem to me that they would be aware of this, because they seem totally unaware. So it seems to indicate their insufficiency. By using bread, and then he can use 1 loaf, Mark can indicate insufficiency. If Mark had used, they forgot to bring any food, or they had a little food with them, it would not make as much sense. Here, the 1 loaf could refer to Jesus, which they are unaware of. But if Mark means the 1 loaf which they were aware of, then it would mean that they had insufficient food for them. And what did Jesus do? Because their focus is still on what ought not to be the focus. So he cautions them about 2 things. What does he caution them about? The first is about what we would call basically false piety. Piety which is external, which is done for show, which is not real. So false piety which is associated with the Pharisees, and godlessness which is associated with Herod. So when he says the east of the Pharisees, he is referring to false piety, merely the external observance of the law, and Herod, he's referring to, you might call, worldliness, godlessness, or another term, selfishness, as Herod has shown in fulfilling his own desires. So the yeast or the leaven refers to the influence. And they, of course, misunderstand, and they think that Jesus, when he talks about yeast of the Pharisees and yeast of the Herod, is still referring to bread. And Jesus is aware. And this awareness leads him to ask them 3 questions, one following the other. And the question that first, what they were discussing, why are you talking about having no bread? This must be interpreted as rhetorical. So when Jesus says, why are you talking about having no bread? Rhetorical means he seems to be saying, do not discuss this mundane issue of bread. Or he seems to be saying, the point I'm trying to make to you is not of bread. That's how the first question must be read. And then you can see that it is how the first question must be read, because the second question is, do you still not perceive or understand? And our minds go back to Isaiah when Jesus spoke in the Gospel of Mark chapter 4, verses 10 to 12, about why he speaks in parables. Do you still not perceive and understand? And then what follows is a very, very, very harsh and hard question. Are your hearts hardened? In chapter 6, verse 52, it was the evangelist Mark who, as the narrator, made this review of the disciples. For they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. That is after the first feeding. Here, it is Jesus who asks them, are your hearts hardened? And then he goes back once again to those who have eyes and fail to see. And so the question is, do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember? When Jesus says, do you not remember? What we must understand is that he's not talking of memory, because someone might say, but what about people who do not have a good memory? What about them? No, it's not memory. He's talking about remember means make present. That is the meaning of remember. Unfortunately, even in the Eucharist, when we say we remember, we think of 2,000 years ago. No, that would be to misunderstand the entire Eucharist. You're not celebrating a ritual. And that's why, for many, the Eucharist has become a ritual. I went for Mass. I heard Mass. Why is that you hear Mass? Because it's a ritual. It is a popular devotion. It is something which has to be done. I heard Mass, finish, let's go. In the old days, and really now, few months ago, is the old days, when we would go for a picnic with a group of our parishioners, and it was a Sunday. We would reach the picnic spot. And as soon as we reached the picnic spot, every person would come in a group to us and say, Father, let's finish Mass, then we can enjoy. Let's finish Mass, then we can enjoy. You see what I mean? So Mass is something which is there, has to be finished. Because we are merely celebrating, unfortunately, in the Mass, a memory. In memory of his death and resurrection. You hear the priest say this every day. In memory of his death and resurrection, not in memory, making present his death and resurrection in the deaths of the millions of people on the streets. Make it present. That is what Jesus asks them, not the memory. Make present now. And if you make present now, then it becomes relevant. And notice, and what you notice is this, in the questions which Jesus asked them, the focus is not the miraculous. The focus is not the extraordinary. The focus is not the stupendous. The focus is on what remains. When I broke the 5 loaves, that is given in the question, the answer of 5 is given in the question, so it cannot be the answer. For the 5,000 is given in the question, so it cannot be the answer. How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? Notice, he doesn't say, when I broke the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Simply the focus is on the loaves. So it's not a question of memory. Otherwise, you would have mentioned fish also, because not only loaves, but there were also fish. So the focus is not memory, the focus is making present now. And when I broke the 7 for the 7,000, or for the 4,000, how many baskets will? So what is important is what is gathered, what is collected, what remains. So they know the answers because they really, so the memory is good. The memory says 12 and memory says 7, but memory is not the point here. They have the memory, but they are unable to make present. You notice? So when they are asked the question, they give the correct answer. 12 and 7 are perfectly correct. Just like Peter gave the correct answer, you are the Christ, but didn't understand it all. So here, the answers are correct. 12 and 7 are the correct answers. And then notice, even though the answers are given, then Jesus says to them, do you not yet understand? Yeast is used to leaven, but also make sour. It can influence. So basically, yeast here is the influence. And we see that the focus of Jesus is not on the miraculous nature, not on the meager resources, but on what remains, on what is gathered.